Human males stay fertile all year? Alien students stunned by the truth. The corridors of the Interstellar Academy were alive with the pulse of 100 worlds. Light spilled through tall crystal-pane windows, refracting into shifting prisms that danced across the polished floors. Voices overlapped in dozens of languages, from the deep, thrumming tones of the Keith to the quick, melodic chatter of the Verdani. Ziraveth kept to the edge of the crowd, her turquoise skin catching glances from a few curious onlookers as she adjusted the strap of her satchel. It was her first day here on Varela Prime, and the station's gravity still felt too heavy, its recycled air too dry compared to the lush humidity of Rilvan. Her people lived by the rhythm of their planet's twin moons and its great seasonal blooms. Everything trade, travel, even courtship moved in cycles. Life without those cycles was unthinkable. Yet here she was, surrounded by species whose calendars did not dictate when they could touch, court, or bring forth life. It was disorienting and intriguing. She found herself in the Academy's arboretum between lectures, seeking the comfort of greenery. Varela's botanical dome stretched high overhead, filled with biomes stitched together in neat, glass-walled partitions. Zyra's hand brushed the broad leaf of a transplanted Rilvan bloom, the faint scent of its pollen offering a thread of home. First day? The voice was warm, a little rough around the edges, and entirely unfamiliar in cadence. She turned to see a tall human standing a few steps away, his dark hair pulled back loosely, a datapad tucked under one arm. His build was lean but strong, his posture at ease in a way that suggested he knew exactly where he belonged. Zyra gave a small nod, her crest of short, silver-white hair shifting with the movement. Yes, I'm here for the comparative reproductive systems course. You are? Dr. Marcus Hale, he said, offering a hand. Xenobiology, visiting from the Terran Academy. And you must be Zira Veth Rilvan biology major, right? I'm your project mentor for the semester. She hesitated before taking his hand. His skin was warmer than hers, the contact strangely grounding. Yes, that's correct. They walked slowly between the trees, Marcus pointing out the different microclimates and how each had been engineered to mimic the homeworlds of the plants within. When they reached the central pond, he gestured toward a pair of Terran swans, gliding on the surface. Brought these from Earth, he said. Beautiful creatures. But unlike humans, they mate for life and only in certain seasons. Zyra tilted her head. Unlike humans? You have no mating season? Not really. Humans can have kids any time of the year, he said casually, crouching to skim his fingers across the pond's surface. The words lodged in her mind like a splinter. No season, no cycle. It had to be an error mistranslation, perhaps some colloquial joke she didn't yet understand. On Rilvan, fertility was a brief, overwhelming bloom that swept through the population once every 3 years. The idea of constant readiness felt unnatural, even dangerous. Her brows drew together. Any time of the year? She repeated, careful to keep her tone polite. Marcus straightened and smiled faintly, as though her doubt was expected. Exactly. I can explain in more detail during our first lab session. She gave a small, non-committal nod, but inside, her thoughts churned. Humans were already regarded as unpredictable in the wider galaxy. Adaptable, yes, but also reckless. This claim sounded like another exaggeration, maybe even propaganda to impress the less experienced species. Still, there was a flicker of curiosity beneath her skepticism. If he was telling the truth, it meant an entirely different way of existing one, without the strict boundaries that had shaped her every instinct since birth. She would find out the truth, she decided, and prove one way or another whether this human fertility claim was fact or fiction. The Arboretum's light dimmed as the station shifted into its evening cycle. But Zira lingered a moment longer, watching Marcus walk away with the easy stride of someone carrying no secret shame about his species' biology. That, perhaps, was the most suspicious thing of all. The lecture hall hummed with quiet anticipation as students filed into their seats, the low murmur of dozens of languages weaving through the air like overlapping currents. Tiered rows of desks curved toward a central dais where a hollow projector flickered to life, casting anatomical diagrams into the space above. Zira slipped into her seat near the back, still unsettled from yesterday's conversation in the Arboretum. She had barely slept, the human's claim rattling in her mind, knowing at her understanding of how biology was supposed to work. Dr. Marcus Hall strode in without hurry, a mug in one hand, a satchel slung across his shoulder. He set the mug down, tapped the control panel, and the diagrams shifted, fading from skeletal overviews to detailed reproductive system models of various species. He greeted the class in 3 languages before switching to the common trade tone. Today, he began, we're comparing reproductive strategies across mammalian analogs. We'll look at seasonal breeders, opportunistic breeders, and, he glanced toward Zira, his eyes twinkling, continuous breeders, like humans. Zira's crest twitched involuntarily. She stared at the floating diagram of a human reproductive system, its labeled parts rotating slowly in the air. Around her, students scribbled notes or tapped at datapads. None of them seemed particularly alarmed at the mention of constant fertility. Was she the only one who found this outrageous? Marcus tapped a control, and the display split into 3 panels, one showing a Rilvan reproductive cycle chart, another a Keith breeding season curve, and finally the human hormonal profile. Seasonal breeders, he explained, time their fertility with environmental conditions, temperature, food availability, migration patterns. This is the most common strategy in the galaxy. But humans? Humans evolved to be fertile year-round. Before she could stop herself, Zira blurted, "That's impossible." Her voice carried more sharply than intended, and several heads turned. Marcus didn't flinch. If anything, his smile deepened, as though he'd been waiting for someone to challenge him. "You think so?" he asked mildly. "Yes," she said, sitting a little straighter. "Biology doesn't just waste resources maintaining fertility without reason. It's inefficient, dangerous." "Perhaps," Marcus sighed, folding his arms, "but humans evolved under chaotic, unstable conditions. Food availability changed unpredictably. Migration was constant. If we'd relied on short, synchronized windows, our population might not have survived. Continuous fertility became our advantage." He gestured to the display, magnifying the human hormone chart. "Note how our reproductive hormones fluctuate in smaller, regular cycles, rather than massive seasonal spikes. Gametes are produced continuously. Ovulation isn't tied to environmental cues. It's an internally driven rhythm." Zira stared at the data, searching for some error. The hormonal graphs were consistent, the numbers plausible. Yet she couldn't reconcile them with her upbringing. On Rilvan, fertility was a rare, almost sacred phenomenon. It was celebrated, ritualized, controlled. This sounded like chaos disguised as biology. Marcus stepped away from the projector. "If you're still skeptical, Zira, I'll invite you to the xenobiology lab this afternoon. We can review the microscopic evidence, gametes, hormone assays, comparative studies. Seeing is believing." The rest of the lecture moved on, but her mind stayed snagged on the offer. Evidence, microscopic, undeniable proof, or the chance to expose human exaggeration. When the session ended, Zira gathered her things slowly, watching Marcus from the corner of her eye as he packed his notes. His movements were unhurried, confident, infuriatingly so. She'd never met a male so comfortable discussing reproduction without hesitation or embarrassment. As she left the hall, she realized she'd already made up her mind. She would go to that lab. She would see his so-called proof. And if humans truly lived in this constant state of readiness, she needed to understand why and what it meant for the galaxy. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit at the campus cafe on Vincenti. Varela Prime sat at the edge of the Arboretum dome, its glass walls giving patrons a view of drifting seed lanterns and slow-turning pollination drones in the artificial twilight. Zira chose a corner table, the kind with curved privacy panels that dulled the ambient chatter. She sipped a steaming cup of lyserute infusion, its faintly sweet aroma doing little to settle the tangle in her mind. Across from her, Marcus looked entirely at ease. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing the subtle lines of muscle along his forearms. He was stirring a drink that gave off a rich, roasted scent. Coffee, she remembered, an earth beverage that humans seemed incapable of functioning without. "I've reviewed your Rilvan reproductive data," Marcus said, resting his cup on the table. "Your people's seasonal bloom is fascinating. It's almost poetic in its symmetry." "It is more than poetic," Zira replied, her tone firmer than she intended. "It is harmony. The bloom ensures that our young are born into the season of abundance. It ensures balance. Without it," she gestured vaguely, as though the consequences were too obvious. "Bloom ensures that our young are born into the season of abundance. It ensures balance. Without it." She gestured vaguely, as though the consequences were too obvious to name. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Without it, humans still managed to survive in deserts, in frozen tundra, on worlds with chaotic seasons. That's why we don't have a fixed mating period. Our environment was too unpredictable. We couldn't afford to wait for the right time. The right time was whenever survival allowed it. Zira's crest rippled with discomfort. "That sounds like desperation, not strategy." "Maybe both," Marcus admitted. "Adaptability often looks like chaos from the outside." She studied him across the table. There was no shame in his voice, no hesitation, as if the idea of constant readiness was as normal to him as breathing. Among her people, even mentioning the bloom outside of the proper rituals was considered deeply intimate. Yet here he was, discussing human fertility, as casually as food imports. Her thoughts snagged on a single question, unbidden. If they are always capable, what stops them from overpopulating every world they touch? "How do you control it?" she asked suddenly. He smiled faintly. "Choice, medicine, social agreements. We've developed ways to prevent conception unless it's wanted. And not every human wants children." Zira blinked. "You choose not to reproduce, even when you can?" "Of course. Raising a child is more than just biology. It's a responsibility." The concept pressed against the limits of her understanding. On Rilvan, the bloom was both a biological imperative and a social obligation. To deny it was unthinkable. Here, Marcus was describing a freedom so alien it made her skin prickle. A group of Verdani students at a nearby table laughed, their voices carrying just enough for Zira to catch a word. Humans. She glanced over and saw them watching Marcus with a mix of curiosity and something sharper wariness. It reminded her of how predators and prey sometimes sized each other up in the same glance. Marcus noticed too, but didn't acknowledge. He took a long drink from his cup, then met her gaze again. "You're welcome to observe more than just the lab data, Zira. If you want to understand us, see how humans live. That's where the real answers are." She hesitated, then nodded. Part of her wanted to dismiss his offer, but another part, the part that had brought her across light years to study other worlds, was already leaning toward yes. As they left the cafe, the station's artificial night cycle had fully settled in, casting the Arboretum in muted blue light. The swans she'd seen yesterday drifted like pale ghosts on the pond. Somewhere above, the faint hum of the gravity regulators reminded her that this entire place, like everything Marcus had just told her, existed outside the cycles she had always known. And for the first time, she wondered if the structure of her world was not the natural order, but simply one way among many. That thought alone was enough to unsettle her all over again. The shuttle's engines gave a low, steady hum as it glided away from Varela Prime, the stars beyond its viewport spilling like a river of frozen light. Zira sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, pretending she was absorbed in the blur of motion outside. In truth, she was hyper-aware of the human sitting beside her. Marcus was scrolling through a datapad, reviewing notes for their field study, seemingly unaffected by the fact that they were about to step into an environment wholly unlike the ordered corridors of the Academy. The destination was New Kyoto, a human-majority colony world settled in the lush belt of the Tanaka system. Marcus had insisted that to truly understand human reproductive adaptability, she needed to see the conditions under which humans lived, worked, and raised children without the filters of academy lectures or sterile lab environments. When they emerged from the shuttle, Zira's senses were struck by the differences immediately. The air was thicker, warmer than the station's controlled climate, laced with the scent of flowering plants and cooking spices. Streets were a blend of smooth alloy walkways and cobblestone paths. Humans moved everywhere, in pairs, in family, groups, alone, and the rhythm of their lives was nothing like the synchronized seasons of Rilvan society. It was the children that unsettled her most. They were everywhere. Some clung to parents' hands, others darted between stalls in the market, their voices a wild mixture of laughter and demands. They were of all ages, tiny infants bundled in cloth, toddlers wobbling on uncertain legs, older children chasing each other with mock weapons. "Do you see it?" Marcus asked quietly, standing beside her in the marketplace's central square. She nodded, though the gesture was tight. "There's no pattern, no bloom. Some are born in the cold, some in the heat. There's no cycle to it at all." "That's the point," Marcus said. "We adapt to whatever conditions we find ourselves in. Humans don't need to wait for the planet to approve our timing." She wanted to argue, to insist that this chaos must carry hidden costs, but the people around her didn't look burdened by it. A young woman with dark hair and warm brown skin balanced a baby on her hip while laughing at something a street vendor said. An older man with weathered hands bent down to hand a sweet to a boy who looked nothing like him, the gesture unforced and genuine. They stopped at a small tea house where Marcus seemed to know the owner. Inside, the walls were lined with hollow photographs of families, some human, some mixed species, gathered around tables or posing in gardens. One photo caught Zira's attention, a human woman in heavy winter clothing cradling a newborn, wrapped in thick fur. The snow in the background glittered in the sunlight. "That's my sister," Marcus said, noticing where her gaze had landed. "She gave birth during the worst winter the colony had seen in a decade. The medical team had to hike through snowdrifts to reach her home." Zira's crest lifted in disbelief. "And the child survived?" Marcus's smile softened. "He's 6 years old now. Bright, stubborn, loves climbing anything he's not supposed to." Something shifted in her then. She had always believed fertility without the guidance of the bloom was reckless, even dangerous. But here was evidence of its strength, the ability to bring life into the harshest seasons, to defy the environment itself. As they left the tea house and continued through the streets, Zira found herself less certain that her people's way was the only right way. Adaptability, she realized, might not be chaos at all. It might be a kind of freedom she had never allowed herself to imagine, and that thought was far more dangerous than Marcus's quiet confidence. The return to Varela Prime was quieter than Zara expected. The shuttle's cabin was dim, the stars beyond the viewport smeared into long streaks by the vessel's slow spin. Marcus sat across the aisle from her this time, his datapad resting idle in his lap. He wasn't watching her, but she felt the weight of his awareness all the same. Back on the station, the Academy's corridors felt almost too clean, too controlled after New Kyoto's unfiltered vibrancy. The students were already deep into midterm preparations, the lecture halls buzzing with study groups. Zyra followed Marcus to the xenobiology lab, her mind still replaying the scenes she'd witnessed. The woman with the winter-born child. The market stalls alive with children of every age. The easy intermingling of families without seasonal boundaries. The lab smelled faintly of antiseptic and ionized air. Rows of glass-fronted containment cases and holographic projection tables lined the room, each station set for a different student research project. Marcus activated the central console, and the holoprojector flared to life, projecting a rotating model of the human reproductive system. Now that you've seen us in context, Marcus said, it's time to put the theory and the observation together. He moved with practiced ease, summoning hormone charts, microscopic imagery of gametes, and comparative studies between humans and various seasonal breeders. Zira leaned in, studying each projection. The human gametes were unlike those of her. People produced continuously in staggering quantities. The hormone curves showed minor fluctuations in steady cycles, independent of environmental triggers. It's consistent, she admitted, her voice low. The data matches the patterns I saw on New Kyoto. You're truly always capable. Marcus offered a faint smile. Capability isn't compulsion. That's what you were missing. It's not that humans can't control it. It's that we can. And that choice is what makes the adaptability work. She considered. That, on Rilvan, the bloom stripped away choice. It was an imperative written into flesh. There was no question of when. The body decided for you. In some ways, she realized, the human system placed more responsibility on the individual. It demanded constant awareness, constant decision-making as they worked on their joint paper. Zira found her earlier certainty dissolving. What had begun as an attempt to expose human exaggeration was becoming something else, an acknowledgement that her worldview had been shaped by limitation, not universal truth. She found herself asking Mark, I don't need to, he said, turning back to his datapad. The truth stands on its own. It was infuriating, and yet she respected it. By the time the presentation date loomed, Zira felt something she hadn't expected at all. Quiet pride in having helped assemble the clearest depiction yet of the human reproductive strategy for the Academy's archives. But beneath that pride was something sharper, an anticipation she couldn't quite name. Because Marcus had hinted, more than once, that there was one final piece of information about humans she hadn't yet seen, and that it would change not only her understanding, but possibly the galaxy's. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it. And that made her want to see it all the more. The auditorium was full long before the symposium began. From her seat at the edge of the raised dais, Zira scanned the crowd, a dense mix of students, faculty, and visiting dignitaries from across Virella Prime. Representatives from half a dozen species had come for the event, their faces and features a living display of galactic diversity. The air hummed with the soft murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional chime of translation devices syncing with the central feed. Marcus stood beside her, calm as ever, reviewing his notes with one hand while holding a cup of coffee in the other. Zira envied that composure. Her own pulse was high, her crest shifting in restless micro-movements. It wasn't nerves about the data. Their research was solid, but something about today felt different. There was a weight in the air, as though they were about to step past the edge of what she'd thought she knew, and into territory no one would be able to ignore. When the lights dimmed, the room fell quiet. Marcus spoke first.